There comes a moment in every life when pain strikes without warning, when we are blindsided by loss, injustice, or betrayal. In those moments we feel powerless, wounded, broken. It is easy to believe we are nothing more than victims of fate, caught in a story we did not write. But what if that is not the whole truth? What if, even in the darkest hour, we hold a quiet, hidden power not to erase what has been done? What if responsibility is the very thing that lifts us from the ruins of suffering and turns our wounds into something more than sorrow? Responsibility precedes meaning because it is through the acceptance of responsibility that meaning begins to take form. A person can search endlessly for purpose, reading books, chasing experiences, pursuing goals, but until they confront what they are willing to be responsible for, that search remains abstract and incomplete. Meaning is not something that floats freely, waiting to be found like a treasure. It is something that is forged through the decisions we make to shoulder what is difficult, to carry what is ours, and sometimes even what is not ours but still needs to be carried. At the core of the human experience is the question not of what we can take from life, but what life demands of us. This is the turning point. Responsibility calls us into relationship with life. It connects us to something outside of ourselves. As long as we live only for our own desires, our purpose remains fragile, easily shattered by disappointment or change. But the moment we take responsibility, whether for a child, a cause, a promise, a community, or even a personal vow, we begin to bind ourselves to something deeper than comfort. That bond, that meaning. Responsibility clarifies what truly matters. It strips away the unnecessary and reveals the essential. When we feel responsible for someone's well-being, we begin to act with more clarity, more focus, more courage. When we hold ourselves accountable to an ideal, our actions are no longer random. They become deliberate. The direction of our lives is no longer dictated by mood, or it is this conviction that begins to give our days structure and our suffering context. In moments of darkness, when the world feels senseless or cruel, it is responsibility that keeps us grounded. We may not understand the reason behind our pain, but if we have committed ourselves to something greater than our own comfort, we endure. And in that endurance, meaning begins to reveal itself. Not in grand epiphanies, but in the slow, persistent fulfillment of duty, in the silent act of showing up when it's hard, in the unwavering promise to keep going because someone or something depends on us. The paradox is that we often wait for meaning before we act, but in reality it is action born out of responsibility that births meaning. Responsibility comes first, quietly, often without applause. It is the unseen cornerstone, the weight we choose to lift. And it is from that weight, from that willing burden, that our life begins to take shape and significance. Freedom in its purest form is often misunderstood. It is commonly seen as the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want, free from constraint, free from obligation. But such an understanding of freedom is shallow. It speaks only to the external aspect of choice, not the internal weight of what those choices mean. True freedom, freedom that leads to a meaningful life, is not the absence of boundaries. Without responsibility, freedom becomes indulgence, drifting, even chaos. It loses its direction, its moral core, its soul. When a person is free in the external sense, but refuses to take responsibility for their actions, their choices lose value. Every decision becomes arbitrary, nothing is anchored. In such a state, freedom does not elevate the person, it diminishes them. They become a leaf in the wind, subject to every whim and craving, unable to commit, to build, or to serve anything beyond themselves. They are free. It floats, but it goes nowhere. It exists, but without destination nor depth. Responsibility is what gives freedom substance. It is what allows our choices to mean something. When we take responsibility, we are no longer just reacting to life, we are answering it. We are saying, I will not just be free from something, I will be free for something. That shift changes everything. Suddenly our decisions are no longer just about preference, but about impact. Freedom alone can lead to a life of comfort, perhaps even excitement, but it cannot lead to a life of meaning unless it is tied to something greater than self-interest. A person who is truly free understands that responsibility is not a burden to be avoided, but a privilege to be accepted. It is true responsibility that we engage with the world in a way that is real. We begin to see our freedom not as a license to escape, but as an opportunity to contribute, to protect, to build, to heal. The most significant moments in a human life often come when one chooses to bind their freedom, a person, a cause, a duty. In doing so, they do not lose their freedom, they fulfill it. And yet this is not an easy path. It is far more tempting to remain in a state of limitless possibility, avoiding commitment, avoiding consequence. But possibility without responsibility is paralyzing. The freedom to choose becomes overwhelming when it is not guided by a deeper sense of purpose. Responsibility is what narrows the path, not in a limiting way, but in a clarifying one. It tells us what matters most. It tells us what is worth our time, our energy, even our suffering. Responsibility transforms freedom from a question of what can I do to what must I do. That shift moves us from wandering to walking, from surviving to serving. It forces us to confront our values, to decide what kind of person we want to be, not just when life is easy, but when it is hard. And that confrontation with ourselves, with the truth of who we are and what we stand for, is where the deepest kind of freedom, not the freedom to flee, but the freedom to stay. Not the freedom to avoid pain, but the freedom to face it with dignity. Not the freedom to do less, but the freedom to do what is right. There is a strange and often misunderstood relationship between burden and direction. In the world we live in, we are taught to avoid weight, to lighten our load. to seek convenience, to run from anything that feels heavy or demanding. But this pursuit of a weightless existence often leads to a life without structure, without purpose, without aim. When there is nothing to carry, there is nothing to guide us. It is the very weight we accept, the responsibilities, the commitments, the obligations that shapes the path we walk and the person we become. The burdens we choose to carry are not just sources of pressure, they are sources of meaning. When we willingly take something upon ourselves, especially something that matters deeply, we are no longer wandering. We are walking towards something. That weight becomes a compass, not because it tells us where to go, but because it gives our steps significance. It tells us that our time matters, that our choices count, that we are connected to something larger than our fleeting impulses. Imagine a life where nothing is urgent, where no one depends on you, where nothing truly matters. At first, it may sound like peace, but over time it reveals itself as emptiness. It is not liberation, it is disorientation. A person without a burden may move freely, but they do not move with purpose. They drift, they experiment, they circle, but they do not progress in it. The weight we carry can take many forms. A promise we've made, a role we stepped into, a truth we refuse to betray, a person we love, a cause we believe in. Each of these anchors us, but they also propel us. When we feel tired, when the path is unclear, it is the memory of that burden, the quiet knowledge that something important relies on us, that keeps us from giving up. It is the voice that says, keep going, not for comfort, but for meaning. We do not choose our burdens randomly. Often they find us in moments of deep clarity or in moments of pain. A parent becomes responsible not simply by biology, but by love. An artist carries the burden of expression because silence feels like betrayal. A teacher, a leader, a healer, they all carry something that demands effort and sacrifice. And yet the weight sharpens them. It shapes their character. It teaches them resilience, patience, humility. The burden is not the enemy. It is the form our purpose takes in the physical world. It is how meaning becomes visible, tangible. It organizes our lives around what matters most. It turns chaos into order, randomness into responsibility. The person who walks without weight may appear free, but often they are lost. The one who carries something, even if it is difficult, even if it causes pain. The irony is that the heavier the burden, the clearer the path can become. Because in carrying something worth carrying, distractions fall away, priorities sharpen. It demands effort, yes, and sometimes sacrifice, but it offers something in return that nothing else can. The knowledge that your life is being used for something meaningful, something real. There's a deep unspoken truth in the human condition. We are not meant to exist solely for ourselves. As much as modern ideals encourage self-fulfillment, independence, and personal success, there remains a kind of hollowness in a life that serves only its own interests. True significance, the kind that roots itself in the soul and gives each day a quiet dignity, emerges when we begin to live not just for ourselves, but for others. Responsibility to others is what pulls us out of the narrow confines of self-concern and connects us to something greater, something enduring. When a person feels responsible for another, whether it's a child, a partner, a friend, a stranger, or even a cause, they begin to live with intention. Their decisions carry more weight because they affect more than just their own comfort or happiness. Every choice becomes an act of care, an expression of commitment, a reflection of who they are in relation to the people and world around them. It transforms existence from a solitary struggle into a shared journey. This kind of responsibility does not always arrive with grand gestures. Often it enters quietly through a promise made, a need observed, a silent understanding, but once it is accepted, it reshapes the way we experience life. We begin to ask different questions. Not only what do I want, but what is needed of me? Not how can I escape pain, but how can I help carry someone else's? They opened a space where meaning can take root. There is something profoundly human in the act of becoming accountable for another's well-being. It is an act that speaks of connection, of empathy, of sacrifice. And in that act, life stops being a series of isolated moments and becomes a narrative. One that is woven through with love, responsibility, and purpose. The person who lives only for themselves may experience pleasure, but it is the person who carries others, who listens. To be responsible for others is also to be vulnerable. It means we allow ourselves to be needed and therefore to be wounded. But in that vulnerability lies something sacred. It is the recognition that our lives are not islands, that what we do matters beyond our own boundaries. We begin to understand that our presence, our voice, our actions, all of these can be the difference in someone else's life. We can be a shelter in someone's storm, a reason someone keeps going, a source of stability in a world that often feels. This responsibility is not always comfortable. It asks much of us. It requires us to be present when we would rather turn away, to give when we feel empty, to listen when we're tired. But it is precisely in these moments of quiet, unseen effort that life begins to shimmer with a kind of sacred significance. There is no spotlight, no applause, but the deep, lasting meaning that doesn't depend on external success or validation, but on the quiet truth that we were there for someone when it mattered. Responsibility to others is what transforms daily routine into devotion. It is what turns sacrifice into love. It reminds us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, and in that reminder, we are not diminished, we are fulfilled. To live with responsibility to others is to live a life that echoes beyond our own story. leaving traces not in monuments or headlines, but in suffering is one of life's inescapable realities. It comes in many forms: loss, failure, illness, rejection, uncertainty, and at some point it visits every life. In the face of suffering, the human heart naturally cries out for relief, for answers, for escape. Yet there is a deeper way to approach suffering, one that does not deny its weight but transforms it. That transformation begins with responsibility. When a person takes responsibility, not necessarily for the suffering itself, but within it, they discover a capacity to endure that would otherwise remain hidden. There is a difference between meaningless suffering and suffering that serves something beyond the pain. When suffering is endured without context, without connection, it feels empty, senseless, and cruel. It becomes a torment that isolates and crushes. But when suffering is tied to responsibility, when it is endured for the sake of another, for a cause, for a promise, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an act of will, even of love. The same pain that once seemed unbearable gains a kind of dignity. The burden remains, but it is carried differently. Responsibility gives suffering a direction. It draws a line between chaos and purpose. A parent who stays strong through sleepless nights for the sake of their child does not suffer less, but they suffer with clarity. A nurse who endures exhaustion and emotional toll to care for the sick, that pain is transformed by purpose. A person fighting through grief to keep a promise to live a life that honors someone they lost, they too carry a weight that is infused with meaning because they have accepted responsibility within the suffering. To take responsibility in suffering is not to pretend that it is easy or fair. It is to say, even in this pain, I will not abandon what matters. I will continue to show up. I will continue to care. I will continue to try. That choice reclaims a sense of agency in the very place where we often feel most powerless. Responsibility reminds us that we still have something to offer, even if it is only suffering becomes more endurable not because the pain lessens, but because the soul expands. Responsibility stretches the human spirit. It deepens our emotional capacity. It calls forth courage, compassion, and resilience we didn't know we had. And when we endure for the sake of another, for a child, a belief, a vow, we are no longer suffering alone. We are participating in something larger than ourselves. We find purpose. We find strength. This perspective does not glamorize suffering, nor does it suggest that we should seek it out. Rather, it recognizes that when suffering inevitably comes, the choice to take responsibility gives us a lifeline. It is a way to orient ourselves in the storm, to say, this hurts, but it is not for nothing. That sense of meaning, born not from ease, but from endurance, becomes responsibility. Does not erase the suffering, but it does something even more powerful. It redeems it. It makes it bearable. It makes it human. It gives us a reason to keep moving, even when every step feels heavy. Life does not spare anyone from hardship. At some point, we all encounter pain that is not our fault, loss that came uninvited, injustice that struck without reason, circumstances that cornered us without warning. In these moments, it is easy, even natural, to see ourselves as victims. And for a time, we are a victim of betrayal, of illness, of grief, of a world that did not go the way we hoped or deserved. But remaining in that identity, seeing ourselves solely through the lens of what has happened to us, begins to strip us of something essential, our power to shape what happens next. This is where responsibility enters. Not as a denial of our pain, but as a refusal to let that pain be the end of the story. Responsibility is not about blame. It does not ask us to say that what happened was right or fair. It does not minimize our wounds or expect us to carry what we cannot yet hold. Instead, it quietly offers us a way forward. It asks, what will you do now with this pain, this loss, this brokenness? Not because you deserved it, but because it is now yours to respond to. In that question lies the possibility of transformation. Responsibility is what allows us to take suffering and begin to shape it into meaning, action, healing. When a person takes responsibility in the aftermath of hardship, they begin to reclaim agency. They begin to move from being someone who was acted upon to someone who acts. This shift is subtle but profound. It does not erase the past, it integrates it. The experience of being hurt, of being wronged, of being devastated remains part of our story, but it is no longer the whole story. Responsibility allows us to say, yes, this happened, but here is how I chose to live with it. Here is how I carried it. Here is what I made from it. That act of choice is what elevates us beyond victimhood into something more resilient, more whole. In the face of cruelty or chaos, responsibility becomes a radical declaration. I will not let this define me. I will not be reduced to this moment. I will not give away the authorship of my life to circumstance. That kind of inner stance does not come easily, and it does not come quickly. It often emerges slowly after grief has had its way, after the heart has broken and begun to mend. But when it comes, it brings with it a quiet strength, the kind that does not depend on control, but on courage. Responsibility does not mean pretending everything is fine. It means stepping forward even when everything is not. It means taking the shattered pieces of a life and saying, I will try to build something with this. Maybe not today, maybe not alone, but eventually. It means refusing to be frozen by what happened and instead beginning, however hesitantly, to engage with life again, with its demands, its needs, its possibilities. This is not about perfection. It is about persistence. The person who takes responsibility in the face of suffering may still fall, still falter, still feel overwhelmed, but each time they get up, each time they choose to act, to care, to try, they move further from the identity of victim and closer to the deeper identity of survivor, of builder, of someone who has decided not to give their pain the final word. They begin to embody a strength that is born not of denial, but of depth. To take responsibility is to say, I cannot control what has happened, but I can choose how I respond. That response may be imperfect, it may be messy, but it is ours. And in that ownership, we begin to rediscover our dignity, our humanity, our place in the world. We become more than the hurt that was done to us, we become more than the losses we have endured. Responsibility is what reawakens our power. Not the power to undo the past, but the power to shape what we do with it. And in doing so, we reclaim the freedom to become something more than victims. We become authors of our lives again. In the end, responsibility is not just an obligation. It is a path to reclaiming our power in a world that often feels beyond our control. It is the quiet strength that pulls us from the edge of despair and guides us back toward meaning. We may not be able to choose the hardships we face, but we can choose how we respond to them. By accepting responsibility, we refuse to be defined by the pain we endure. Instead, we redefine ourselves through the actions we take, the love we give, and the courage we summon in the face of suffering. Responsibility is not a cure for all that hurts, but it is the force that turns the weight we carry into the very thing that gives our lives direction. In taking responsibility, we become more than victims of circumstance. We become authors of our own story, creating meaning from the challenges we face and finding strength in the very place we once believed would break us.